Hello everyone, friends. Today we're diving back into the world of caves. And not just any caves, we're breaking down the case of the trapped Floyd Collins. In its time, this incident caused a massive stir and remains the most famous in speleology. But before I start the story, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll jump right into our tale. As usual, we'll start from the beginning. Floyd Collins was born on June 20th, 1887, on one of the farms in the state of Kentucky. His parents, Lee and Martha Collins, owned agricultural lands. And while they weren't destitute, their life was far from easy. In 1915, his mother died of tuberculosis, and following her, in 1922, his older brother James died of typhoid fever. But he still had 3 brothers and 2 sisters left. After his mother's death, his father remarried a woman who was the widow of a speleologist. And that's not surprising, since those areas are full of caves, and much of life revolves around them. The Collins family's lands were located just a short distance from Mammoth Cave, the longest cave system in the world, stretching underground for nearly 700 kilometers. The early 20th century became a time of growing interest in speleology. People eagerly visited caves, traveling from other states to see them and willing to pay for entry. This era is even called the Kentucky Cave Wars. Landowners tried to find caves on their properties and turn them into tourist attractions to make a good profit. And back then, it really brought in decent income. As I mentioned, the Collins family's log cabin was just 4 miles from Mammoth Cave, a major tourist landmark. Collins began exploring Kentucky's caves alone when he was only 6 years old. As a child, he would go with his father to Mammoth Cave and sell rocks and arrowheads he found underground to tourists. By age 10, he dropped out of school and started roaming local caves with a lard-fueled lantern, searching for Native American relics. By 12, he had memorized the turns of the nearby Salt Cave and ventured off the beaten paths, finding moccasins, tomahawks, beads, and relics that no one had discovered before. In 1910, when Collins was 14, a geologist from New York paid the young speleologist $2 a day to guide him through that labyrinth. For 2 years, the farm boy taught the geologist the basics of speleology, while the geologist taught the farm boy the basics of geology. These lessons later convinced Collins that all the caves in the region were connected. As a teenager, Collins regularly squeezed through cracks that made other explorers turn pale with fear. His reputation as Kentucky's best speleologist spread throughout the county, and locals told wild stories about how Collins would dive into a cave and emerge miles away, popping his head out of a haystack like a gopher and startling an unsuspecting farmer. He even learned to play church hymns on stalactites like a xylophone. Living near Mammoth Cave, which was and still is hugely popular, Floyd watched as its owner quickly grew rich. Almost all caves were privately owned and brought in good money, so Floyd decided to follow the same path. Indeed, in those days, this quirky business brought in very decent income, but there was fierce competition. No wonder they call that time the Cave Wars, and you'll soon see why. After surveying his father's lands, in 1917, Floyd Collins did find a very beautiful cave, which he named Crystal Cave. But there was one catch. This cave was indeed beautiful, with stunning stalactites, and it could compete with neighboring caves. However, it was far from any automobile roads. To reach it, you had to hike for an hour or more through bushes and rocks, and no one wanted to bother with that. Moreover, as I said, there was intense competition in the area, and owners of nearby caves told tourists that Crystal Cave was closed, flooded, or very dangerous. They blocked roads with boulders. Once, 5 sturdy young men beat up Floyd Collins and made it clear that a new cave in the area wasn't needed. The idea with Crystal Cave failed. But Floyd didn't despair and decided to search further. He found another cave which he named Sand Cave. It was on the lands of B. Doyle and had a prime location. It was close to the road. And most importantly, it was sort of ahead of a string of very popular caves like Mammoth. That way, tourists heading to see the caves would start their journey right there, and Floyd would skim all the cream. It seemed his dream was starting to come true. Floyd made an agreement with B. Doyle to explore Sand Cave and split the profits if the cave proved worthy of showing. According to the entrepreneur's plan, the cave should bring them dollars once it became popular. But first, they needed to thoroughly explore the cave and lay out tourist routes. And so, On the afternoon of January 30th, 1925, carrying a kerosene lamp, Floyd arrived at the entrance to Sand Cave. Collins walked over wet leaves and melting snow. It was an unusually warm winter morning. For him, this was just an ordinary workday. The 37-year-old speleologist had already spent several days putting in 12 hours each to tidy up the approach to the cave, sawing fallen trees, clearing leaves, and so on. But today, he decided to descend into the cave's depths. Collins took off his coat and hung it on a nearby boulder. He lit the kerosene lamp, slung a rope over his shoulder, and began descending into the cave, whose entrance was a small hole resembling a manhole cover. He lowered himself down the rope about 4.5 meters and stepped into the darkness. The last rays of sunlight remained behind. Not far from the entrance, the cave began to descend deeper, like steps about 1.5 meters high. He carefully climbed down, holding the kerosene lamp in front of him. Ahead, the cave turned into a narrow shaft of uneven, loose rocks. Collins lay on his stomach and crawled. At a depth of 15 meters, he encountered the first narrowing of the cave. But Collins was unfazed. He wasn't underground for the first time. With the right technique, a person of his build could squeeze through a crack as narrow as 20 centimeters. He pressed his arms to his sides, exhaled deeply to flatten his chest, and began rocking his hips and abs, pushing his body forward with his toes. After some time, the cave widened, and he could crawl on all fours. He passed a few more narrow spots and emerged into a slanted pit. This pit went down 3 meters and, curving horizontally, ended in a narrow crack. His brother Homer later described this place as a shaft no bigger than your own body, littered with protruding rocks that dig into your flesh and tear your clothes. Collins had spent the previous days clearing rocks from here, and the crack at the bottom finally seemed passable to him. He wanted to create an interesting route for tourists, but to do that, the cave needed some cleaning up. He began descending into the crack feet first. Rocks squeezed his torso. Above him, millimeters from his neck, hung shards of rock. But he successfully passed this dangerous spot and emerged into a large hall, in the middle of which was a ledge ending in an 18-meter drop. Collins was thrilled with his discoveries. He had uncovered a magnificent hall studded with beautiful stalactites. But that wasn't all. The cave went deeper and he planned to explore it. He tied the rope around a boulder and began descending the 18-meter cliff. Once down, he discovered yet another large hall that he desperately wanted to explore. But by then, his kerosene lantern had started flickering. Floyd knew how dangerous it was to be left in the cave without light, so he abandoned the tempting idea of continuing his exploration. He started heading back, successfully climbing up to the ledge, then proceeding to the narrow horizontal crack. He lay on his back, pressed his arms to his sides, exhaled, and slid forward into the tight crevice, pushing the lantern ahead of him. But suddenly, the cave plunged into darkness, a primal darkness that surface dwellers never experience. In such conditions, vision is so useless that fish living in underground rivers have no eyes. However, Collins didn't panic. He had been left in caves without light before. Besides, he had almost crawled to the bottom of the 3-meter pit. The path ahead was familiar, and he could make his way out by feel. He braced his foot against the cave wall and began pushing himself forward. But when he passed this spot the first time, he could see the dangerous rocks and avoid them. Now he was moving in complete darkness, guessing, and with an unlucky jerk forward, a piece of limestone crumbled under his feet, and a huge boulder fell from the wall, pinning his ankle. Instinctively, Floyd thrashed his legs, trying to free himself, but this caused a stream of small gravel to pour down on him, and the stone wedged in even tighter. He was completely stuck. His head was right under the 3-meter pit, and the cave embraced the rest of his body like a straitjacket. Wrapped in this stone cocoon, Collins clawed at the cave walls. Blood oozed from under his fingernails. He began to sweat, then shiver until exhaustion threw him into sleep. He entered a torturous routine. Sleep, wake, scream. Sleep, wake, scream. Minutes turned into hours, his voice faded, his hands went numb. The pinned ankle throbbed unbearably. Rock shards cut into his body like razors. He lost track of time. Fortunately, trickles of melting snow ran down the cave walls, and Floyd could drink the liquid. Finally, after 25 hours since he got stuck, he heard someone's voice. "Come to me," he shouted, snapping out of his stupor. "I'm stuck here." Few people worried about Collins when he didn't return home on Friday evening. Earlier that week, he had spent nearly 30 hours in the cave. He had slept in 3 different houses, and when he didn't come back, his host for the night simply assumed he was sleeping elsewhere. Only the next morning did locals realize he might be trapped. The first person brave enough to enter the cave was 17-year-old Jewel Estes, a flexible kid, but with no speleology experience. Estes never made it to Collins. He was scared by the narrow spot before the pit, but he got close enough to call his name and learn that Floyd was stuck. One after another, men tried to reach Collins, and each emerged covered in mud, solemnly swearing never to enter that godforsaken hole again. By midday, dozens of locals had gathered outside. No one managed to reach the trapped man. "I wouldn't go back in there even if they paid me $1,000, no matter how much I need the money," declared rescuer Ellis Jones. "Most Kentucky caves are carved from solid limestone and are relatively safe. But Sand Cave is a pile of sandstone and limestone blocks interspersed with layers of sand and clay. This makes the cave unstable. It resembles more of a tunnel with a ceiling of overhanging rocks that could fall from the walls at any moment." At 4 p.m., Collins' 22-year-old brother Homer arrived and saw dozens of men arguing outside Sand Cave. Homer Collins ignored them, slipped into the cave still dressed in city clothes, and was met with the smell of cigarette smoke and alcohol that local farmers had brought in. When he reached the 3-meter pit above his brother's head, he stripped off his pants, shirt, and shoes and slid down in his underwear. Homer immediately faced the problem that stumped every subsequent rescuer. If a person descended into the shaft headfirst, they had to work upside down. Exiting, they had to push feet first up the steep slope, then back up another 6 meters before turning around. If they descended feet first, like Homer had just done, they couldn't lower the upper part of their body to Floyd's level without bending into nearly impossible positions. Worse, Collins himself blocked his own rescue. Pinned from the chest down, his arms and legs were out of sight for rescuers. Only the top of his head was visible in the distance, and how to pull him out was completely unclear. But Homer managed to feed his brother. He poured a pint of coffee into his mouth and fed him 9 sausage sandwiches. He also tried to chip away loose rocks from the wall to widen the passage around his brother's body. But as soon as he removed them, new rocks fell in their place, burying his brother even more. After a few hours, Homer surfaced. All this time, he had worked in his underwear. And remember, it was January. The skin on his fingers hung in shreds, and he was on the verge of hypothermia. He needed rest. After him, dozens more men tried to reach Floyd, but without success. At midnight, Homer descended into the cave again. For about 8 hours, Homer Collins chipped at the rocks, pinning his brother at the chest with a crowbar. But the cave wouldn't yield. By sunrise, Homer's arms and back ached, and his mind was in despair. Homer surfaced on the morning of February 1st, and his brother had been trapped for 48 hours already. A real crowd had gathered at the cave, resembling more of a fair. People smoked, drank moonshine, and suggested all sorts of ideas for rescuing the trapped man. Some suggested sending a circus acrobat with a chisel and hammer into the cave. Others proposed using dynamite, while a third group talked about amputation and debated blood loss. And it seemed Floyd had become a victim of his own talent. The cave he had navigated terrified even experienced speleologists. Only his brother could reach him, but he was barely standing from exhaustion. He gave a large sum of money to a group of teenagers hanging around the cave and told them to deliver food and a blanket to his brother. The short teenagers were more flexible and much smaller than adult men. They might succeed in reaching Floyd, and after some time, the teenagers surfaced and reported that they had fed Floyd and covered him with blankets. However, later those blankets and food would be found stuffed in cave cracks where the teenagers had tossed them. They had simply deceived Homer and never reached the victim. Perhaps they didn't even try. And that morning, as Homer warmed himself by the fire, a local reporter approached him. He was a short man with a childlike face. He said, "I heard about that guy who's stuck in the cave." Homer looked him up and down and said, "If you want information, there's the hole. Climb in and find out for yourself." Obviously, he just wanted to get rid of the annoying reporter, but Homer underestimated this guy. His name was William Burke Miller, known as Skeets. As a 21-year-old reporter, he earned only $25 a week. His articles were rarely bought, so when the editors of the Louisville Courier-Journal mentioned a man stuck in a cave, Miller eagerly took the story. He wanted to write a truly great report, so when Homer challenged him, Miller took off his suit, put on overalls, and grabbed a flashlight. The reporter weighed only 50 kilograms, and he slowly navigated the narrow shafts. The cave had become completely wet, as the gathered crowd had lit fires near the entrance, causing the snow to melt even more intensely. With horror, Miller squeezed under overhanging rocks. And finally, at the last narrowing, he shouted into the darkness and heard a faint groan. Miller pushed forward and rolled into the 3-meter pit right onto Colin's head. The reporter tried to ask questions of the trapped man, but he could no longer respond coherently, so Miller gave him water and a sandwich and hurried to the surface. It took him half an hour to reach the top. When Homer saw him, he was surprised and decided this brave guy could be useful. By this time, Floyd had been in the cave for 73 hours. He had started hallucinating and told Miller he saw angels. On the morning of February 2nd, Robert Burden arrived. He was a lean 33-year-old fire lieutenant who looked very confident. He actually managed to reach the trapped man. Seeing Collins for the first time, Burden said, "We've got a hell of a problem here, but I think we can get you out with a rope." Then Burden peered into the hole, gripped Collins' body, and winced. "We might tear your leg off," he said. "Tear off my leg, but get me out," replied Floyd. It's unclear if Burden knew that Floyd Collins had already lost touch with reality, and his responses might be inadequate. But upon surfacing, the firefighters began convincing the crowd that the only way to extract him was with a rope. This method would undoubtedly break his leg and possibly even tear off the limb. People started saying the victim would bleed out before reaching the surface. Others said he'd be shredded by the sharp rocks protruding from the walls before they dragged him to the cave exit. A doctor in the crowd said that pulling him with a rope would stretch his organs like taffy. He'd simply die. But the fire lieutenant insisted that pulling with a rope was the only way. And at 5 p.m., they brought a special harness into the cave. Homer Collins, Skeets Miller, and Robert Burden descended into the darkness with a long rope. Homer went first to calm his brother's nerves. He fed the trapped man ham sandwiches, gave him coffee, and a sip of whiskey. Collins confessed that he really didn't want to lose his leg. Homer listened patiently. Then he gave Collins a sedative, which, according to Burden, was designed to boost his vital forces and withstand the shock if they did tear off his leg. Obviously, this was something from the now-banned drugs that were still available in pharmacies back then. Homer secured the harness around Collins' chest. Miller perched at the top of the pit. Burden grabbed the rope farther along the cave. Several other men helped near the cave entrance. On Homer's count, the rope tightened. Collins gasped. As his body lifted from the debris, Burden gritted his teeth and growled at the men to pull harder. Miller yanked the rope, and the trapped man let out a heart-wrenching scream of pain. Collins was stuck in a horizontal position. The lower part of his body was encased in rocks and gravel. His back curved into an L shape. He started screaming, "Don't do this! Don't do this! Stop!" Homer couldn't bear his brother's screams. He turned and yanked the rope from the men's hands. Their plan failed. The team decided to leave and rethink their actions. Everyone was shaken by the experience. Burden passed out while crawling to the exit. When they finally surfaced, they could barely stand, and people carried them to the fire on their hands. Outside, the crowd had grown, and among them was the one person who could free Floyd Collins, his childhood friend Johnny Gerald. It had been 88 hours since Collins got stuck in that damned hole. When Gerald arrived, he saw a drunken crowd of 200 people with no speleology experience. He was especially outraged by Lieutenant Burden and his plan to yank his friend out like a fish on a line. And Johnny Gerald was an experienced speleologist. He had pulled people out of caves more than once. When Floyd Collins heard his voice, he started shouting, "Send him down here, only he can get me out." However, Gerald was too stocky to squeeze into the 3-meter pit. He had to spend several hours widening it, pulling out rocks. Only by midnight did he reach his friend. He began digging gravel and removing rocks next to Floyd's chest. And it seemed to be working. Collins' torso appeared, then his hips, then the upper part of his thigh. For the first time, Collins could move his right leg, though it hurt unbearably. Before Gerald left, Collins reportedly said to him in farewell, "Don't let anyone come down here except you and your group." Gerald swore to keep his word, convinced that people without cave experience, no matter how sincere their intentions, would just cause a collapse and bury the victim. So when a team of professional stonecutters, who had been standing in the cold for 5 hours waiting for volunteers, approached Gerald with a plan to survey the passage and chisel out the limestone above Floyd's head, Gerald told them to get lost. Lieutenant Burden returned Tuesday morning around 10 o'clock and again proposed his rope plan. The night before, he had contacted his fire department and requested a fire hose hoist. He said, "I've figured out that if I can lower it into the passage and get it working, I'm sure it'll succeed." But Gerald was the crowd's new hero, and Burden's plan was rejected. By this time, Miller's report was ready. Newspapers hit doorsteps, and that morning, Floyd Collins woke up a star, well, as did reporter Miller. This popularity only swelled the crowd around the cave. By this point, Floyd Collins had spent 103 hours underground. And that morning, reporter Miller returned to the cave. Gerald was exhausted from work, and others weren't allowed near the cave. Then the reporter proposed a plan. He would descend into the cave and organize a human chain to haul rocks to the surface and pass food and drink to the victim. They would also shore up the walls with boards where possible to prevent collapses. And reporter Miller reached Floyd again and, like Gerald before him, began digging around the body, removing rocks. Soon, the gap around the body was already 12 centimeters. His team strung light bulbs through the cave, and now orange lighting played on the walls. Over the next 2 hours, Miller passed 2 buckets of dirt and rocks. Eventually, he took a break and asked for some milk and whiskey. As the reporter fed the trapped man, Collins said, "I believe I'll go to heaven, but I feel like they'll get me out of here alive and with both legs." And if you think the journalist was only hauling rocks and risking his life in the cave, that's not all. He still managed to write. And the next morning, newspapers published text as if from Floyd Collins himself, so to speak, a report straight from underground. Here's that excerpt. "On Monday, I kept moving my leg when I felt strong enough, thinking I could still free myself. But every time, I heard pebbles falling into the deep pit right behind my back. It made me shiver. I kept thinking about what would happen if the rock above me fell. I tried to direct my mind to something else all the time, but it was useless. I couldn't do much to help those who came to my aid. But I knew many people were ready to do everything in their power. That gave me courage. Tuesday morning, I thought to myself, 4 days here and still no closer to freedom than on the first day. How will this end? Will I get out or—" I couldn't think about it. I faced death before. It doesn't scare me. But why is it so long? Oh God, be merciful. I want you to tell everyone outside that I love each of them and am happy because so many people are trying to help me. Tell them I won't give up, that I'll fight and be patient and never forget them. You're going out now, but don't leave me alone for too long. I want you to be with me, and I'll continue to help in any way I can to move some of this rock." And thanks to this mini interview, Floyd Collins' story grew from some marginal curiosity into a national event. From Los Angeles to New York, front-page headlines described Collins' plight, using gigantic fonts usually reserved for war news. His patience through long hours of agony, his constant hope when life seemed nearing its end, is enough to strengthen any man's heart, wrote Miller. In other words, the reporter gave readers a hero to empathize with, someone to root for. Just a few hours after the life-changing interview, Miller and his human chain returned to Sand Cave, and the reporter planned to crawl feet first onto Collins, wedge a crowbar into the rock, and use a jack to lift the stone off his leg. But everything went wrong. Under the jack's pressure, the crowbar slipped sideways and slid off. Reporter Miller said these actions in such an awkward position caused him severe pain in his stomach, back, neck, wrists, fingers, and forearms. He decided to ignore the pain until his muscles failed completely. When the next attempt failed just as badly, Miller tried a new angle. The jack pressed into the crowbar. Tension built. The rock shifted. Collins looked back and saw the stone trembling. "Keep turning, buddy. It's coming off," shouted Floyd. Lieutenant Burden, who had joined the human chain, recalled, "I never heard anything more joyful in my life than when he said the rock was starting to come off his leg." Miller stared intently at the rock. With each turn, the stone moved. His body filled with adrenaline. Fingers trembled. Sweat streamed down his forehead. His heartbeat quickened as one of the wooden blocks began to slip. Suddenly, the structure collapsed, and the rock returned to its place, slamming into Collins' leg. Miller tried again and again and again. He added wooden blocks, removed wooden blocks, repositioned the crowbar. He used every crevice, crack, and angle to secure a stable position. The trapped man encouraged him the whole way. "You can do it, buddy. I believe in you," shouted Floyd. Around 1 a.m., Miller collapsed from exhaustion. The rock wouldn't budge anymore. Burden recalled it this way: "We all wanted to sit right there and cry. It was just awful." Before leaving, Miller adjusted Collins' blanket and hung a light bulb around his neck for warmth. When he crawled out of Sand Cave with purple bruises on his arms, he saw dozens of soldiers standing on the ledge above the cave. The National Guard had arrived. Floyd had been in the cave for 112 hours already. When Miller left the cave, leadership shifted to a new figure, Henry Carmichael, General Superintendent of the Kentucky Rock Asphalt Company. A few days earlier, he had sent men to help shore up the cave with wooden planks. On Wednesday at 2:30 a.m., shortly after Miller's failed jack attempt, Carmichael sent 2 men into Sand Cave to assess the structure's stability. The cave entrance was wider than ever, thanks to the human chain's efforts, and new wooden supports held the entrance steady. But as they descended deeper, the wooden props disappeared, and the cave squeezed tighter than usual. Overall, Kentucky caves are remarkably stable. Rocks don't loosen or shift. Sand Cave was different. The melting snow from the fires, pouring into the tunnel, and the human chain's presence caused fluctuations in temperature and humidity. The ceiling began to sag. One of the volunteers saw this and felt dizzy. He heard Collins' groans ahead, but also heard the eerie creak of sliding rocks and insisted on turning back. The second volunteer, named Casey Jones, heard the same sounds but pressed on. He reached the pit. Collins begged Jones to come down. Every moral instinct told Jones to help, but self-preservation told him to turn and leave. At first, self-preservation won. "I can't right now, Floyd," said Jones, "but I'll do it when I come back." Behind him, his partner begged to leave. Below him, Collins shouted, "I'm thirsty. Help me." Jones decided to descend into the pit anyway. He slid headfirst and hastily gave Collins coffee. Surprisingly, he refused. Jones realized Collins wasn't really thirsty. He was just scared and lonely. From above came a voice. "For God's sake, Jones, get out. Get out. Because of you, we'll all die." You hear that cracking. The ceiling's about to collapse. Jones looked at Collins, set down the coffee, and climbed out of the pit. He crawled under the sagging ceiling, glancing back, horrified to see the passage behind him compressing like a vice. The ceiling collapsed. A few hours earlier, the light bulb wrapped around Collins' neck had illuminated that part of the cave like a beacon. But around 4 a.m. on Wednesday, February 4th, on the 114th hour of this saga, the walls closed in, and Sand Cave plunged back into darkness. Collins' sobs were now muffled. He was behind the rocks. The trapped man shouted, "Stay with me. Oh, please don't go. Don't leave me alone." On Wednesday morning, Miller returned to the cave and was stunned by the ceiling collapse. When he dove into Sand Cave and faced a pile of orange-gray rocks, his heart sank. He tried to shift some rocks, but every movement caused more to fall from the ceiling. A large chunk of clay fell on his leg. He wrote, I managed to slip out from under it, but it scared me badly. When he returned to the surface, his nose was bleeding. Burden recalled. He didn't tell me what was wrong, just said, "For God's sake, don't go back in there and make sure Homer Collins doesn't go in either." There was no need to worry about Homer. He was suffering from coughing fits and could hardly participate in rescue efforts. But Johnny Gerald was furious. He had been right, they caused the collapse. Over the next 8 hours, Gerald entered and exited Sand Cave at least 5 times. In the woods, men sawed trees and chopped logs to support the remaining vault's walls. Underground, Gerald's team shored up cracks and shaky boulders with fresh planks. When Gerald descended the first time, Collins heard his friend crawling toward the pit and asked him to bring a cheese sandwich. When Gerald explained to Floyd that a collapse had occurred, the man began to cry. Working at the edge of human capability, Gerald hauled 4 barrels of rocks out of the cave. After a few hours, a sliver of light pierced the darkness again. The light bulb on Collins' neck was visible once more. Soon, there was enough space to squeeze through to the victim. Gerald returned to the surface to gather gear and tell the men gathered outside that Collins would join them in an hour. He was sure he'd pull him out soon. At 10:30 p.m. on February 4th, Johnny Gerald entered Sand Cave for the last time. The plan was he'd slip past the collapse and feed his friend. Then, using a grease gun, he'd coat the rocks around his leg. Simply put, he planned to slather Collins with Vaseline and pull him out of the crevice. It was actually a solid plan. But when Gerald crawled into the cave and reached the collapse, he gasped. The light from the bulb was no longer visible. The ceiling had collapsed again. This experienced speleologist cried and shouted, "Floyd!" Suddenly, a rock fell on Gerald's head. He rubbed his head and called Floyd again. In response came the words, "I've already gone home and gone to bed." Obviously, Collins was delirious. Then a sharp, heavy rock fell from the ceiling and landed right on Gerald's back. He barely made it to the surface and declared, "I won't go back into that damned place even if they give me the whole state of Kentucky." However, this wasn't the end. Lieutenant General Denhart gathered miners and shouted, "We've lost hope of reaching Floyd the simple way. Now, boys, it's up to you. You'll drill through the earth and save this guy. Spare no expense. Kentucky's wallets are open. Ask for whatever you want, but get him out from underground." On Thursday, February 5th, the state took control of Collins' rescue. Lieutenant General Denhart, who reportedly told Homer that getting Collins out would require people with brains, was appointed in charge of the rescue operation. His first order was to ban everyone from entering Sand Cave. His second order was to dig a shaft. Heavy equipment arrived at the site, but soon it became clear that exhaust fumes were entering the cave, and Floyd might suffocate before they dug him out. The miners realized they'd have to dig a 17-meter shaft with picks and shovels. Floyd had spent 215 hours in the cave already. By then, the area around the cave resembled more of a fair or carnival. Crowds of people wandered about. Some sold hot dogs, others solicited donations. Snake oil salesmen peddled miracle potions. Moonshiners traded booze. Families spread blankets near the cave and picnicked with their children. Reverend James Hamilton preached to 5,000 people. And people came from neighboring states to see the wondrous cave with the stuck guy inside. Over that time, more than 10,000 people visited it. What bitter irony. Floyd dreamed of finding a popular cave, and it seems he found one. Be careful what you wish for. In the evening on Sunday, rain started, and they covered the cave with tarps. By then, they had only drilled 7 meters out of 17. Science enthusiasts joined in too. They connected a radio amplifier to the wire attached to the light bulb on Floyd's chest. The scientists thought the amplifier could pick up vibrations when Collins moved. And indeed, the amplifier crackled 20 times a minute, which was an encouraging sign, suggesting Collins might still be breathing. 288 hours had passed, and conspiracy theories began to emerge. Some claimed there was no man in the cave at all, and it was all a scam to collect donations and write sensational articles. Some conspiracy theorists went so far as to try to discredit the rescue itself, sending telegrams supposedly from Floyd. "Please refute the statement that I am buried alive in Sand Cave. Tell Mom I'm fine. I'm coming home. Floyd Collins." One rumor said the Collins family, intoxicated by the publicity, was deliberately delaying the rescue. Others claimed Johnny Gerald deliberately kept rescuers out of Sand Cave because he worked in real estate and had a financial interest in Crystal Cave, meaning an interest in Collins' death. An outraged Robert Burden told newspapers that Johnny Gerald was guilty of nothing less than murder. These accusations couldn't be ignored. An investigation showed that Gerald had indeed refused help. But so had Burden, Carmichael, and Denhart. Each rescue team thought competing rescuers were incompetent, which was partly true. People who knew caves lacked organizational skills, and vice versa. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, the court concluded that no one was at fault for what happened. At that point, Floyd had been underground for 360 hours. Above him, there were still 16 meters of earth and rocks. He had been underground for 17 days, 12 of them without food and water, and 4 days without the light that provided warmth. The odds were slim, but rescuers hoped he was still alive. Newspapers published articles about miners who survived underground for long periods. Churches sent donations to rescuers, and readers sent letters to newspapers. One Chicago fortune teller sent sketches of coffee grounds that settled at the bottom of her cup. They formed a heart shape, proof, she said, that Collins was still alive. At 1:30 p.m. on Monday, February 16th, a chisel broke through into Sand Cave. This was the 411th hour of the saga. Workers frantically pulled rocks to widen the opening. Finally, a rescuer named Ed Brenner shone a flashlight into the darkness and confirmed they had reached that very 3-meter pit. And, according to reporter Miller, everyone near the cave stopped breathing for 5 minutes. They waited for what the rescuer would say. Brenner descended into the pit and shone the flashlight on the trapped man. He saw some strange glimmer. A second later, he understood its source. It was Collins' gold tooth. 5 minutes later, he surfaced, shook his head, and said just one word: dead. And later, they claimed Collins had been dead for about 3 days. If that's true, he died shortly after his solitary light bulb went out. His last connection to the world above. Soon, Cave City emptied. The shaft was filled with earth, and Floyd Collins' name, which had dominated front pages for 2 weeks, began to be forgotten. But this wasn't the end of the story. Literally a few weeks later, the landowner where Sand Cave was, B. Doyle, put up a sign on the highway that read, "200 yards from us is the body of Floyd Collins, entombed in Sand Cave." For 50 cents, curious visitors could look at the gaping hole that had swallowed the man Doyle once called a friend. Contrary to rumors, the Collins family returned to farm life and didn't get richer. After the National Guard left, locals saw Floyd's father scavenging the rescue site for glass bottles. Reporter William Burke Skeets Miller received an offer to tour the country and tell this story to people. He was offered a fabulous fee for the time, $50,000, but he refused and continued working as a simple reporter at the newspaper. However, the following year, his coverage of this tragedy won the Pulitzer Prize in reporting. But the deceased's brother, Homer Collins, toured with vaudeville acts for 8 months, entertaining audiences with stories of his brother's childhood. But the performances weren't for personal gain. Since his brother was declared dead, Homer vowed to pull him out of that cave. He wrote, "I kept thinking about Floyd lying in the mud, where he suffered in ways we can't imagine. I'll never find peace of mind if he stays in that cave." Homer used the profits from performances to retrieve his brother's body. On April 17th, 7 miners redug the shaft and entered Sand Cave, this time for Collins' body, and they removed the stone pinning his leg. On April 26, 1925, Floyd Collins was lowered into a grave at the family cemetery. His grave was marked with a stalagmite headstone. In 1927, relatives sold their farm and Crystal Cave, which belonged to Floyd. This was the one he found first, far from roads. They sold everything for pennies and earned only $10,000. And cave tourism was no longer as popular after Collins' death. The same publicity that drew thousands to Kentucky worked in reverse. People realized it was very dangerous and were no longer as eager to crawl through caves. The Collins family farm, with all its contents, including the cemetery and Crystal Cave, was bought by an enterprising dentist, Harry Thomas, who, as they say, flipped the game, and then real madness ensued. He exhumed Floyd Collins' body, embalmed it, placed it in a crystal coffin, and set that coffin inside Crystal Cave. To the horror of Floyd's relatives, tourists who previously didn't want to go there because Crystal Cave was far from roads now flocked in droves, bringing Dr. Thomas fabulous profits. The sign read, "Come to Crystal Cave to see the embalmed body of the greatest cave explorer ever known." However, that wasn't all. In September 1927, unknown persons tried to steal Floyd's body from the cave. The first attempt failed, but the second, organized in March 1929, succeeded. Grave robbers stole Collins' body and tried to dump it in the Green River in Kentucky. But the body got tangled in bushes. Dr. Thomas retrieved the remains again and placed them back in the coffin, but this time locked it and hung multiple chains. And most likely, these were echoes of the cave wars. Competitors wanted to lure away tourists and deprive the doctor of such an ace, so they kidnapped the body. However, Floyd Collins lay once more in the crystal coffin in Crystal Cave, now girded with chains. And 32 years later, in 1961, the U.S. government finally bought Crystal Cave along with Collins inside. They planned to turn the caves into a national park. The national park bought it for $285,000. Today, that's over $2 million. Dr. Thomas made a great deal. The park management eventually closed access to this cave. In 1989, the body was reburied at Baptist Cemetery. In 1977, Roger Brucker went into Sand Cave for excavations. He said, "It was the scariest cave I've ever been in." His team found several bottles and cans, pieces of wooden braces, a steel poker, fragments of an army blanket, and a pair of electrical wires. A few years later, the cave entrance was permanently sealed with steel gates. This story became a legend in U.S. speleology. Several books were written about it, and even musicals were staged. And as cynical as it sounds, Floyd made his cave popular and even earned millions on it, as he dreamed. True, that money went not to his family, but to some dentist. And if you're interested in my opinion, for me, this story isn't just the tragedy of one man. For me, it's a slice of time. It's like you're transported to the 1920s in the US, where soldiers, scientists, reporters, adventurers all act boldly and risk their lives for a barely known person, where a tragedy spawns a sensation, where people make money out of thin air and build businesses that are unthinkable today. You can feel differently about it, but peering into that crack and seeing how people lived in those times is, in my view, incredibly fascinating. Whatever you think about this story, write in the comments. Don't forget to like this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I know many watch me without subscribing. Please subscribe. It's easy for you and it'll make me happy, and don't forget to like.